Well, friends, as we come towards the end of the year, there is one matter of concern that I really wanted to talk about. I've asked a friend, Michael Swain, who's the Executive Director of Freedom of Religion South Africa, if he would come and talk about what is freedom actually, and then in particular, a matter related to the CRL, and we'll get into those details in a moment, a push to regulate religion in South Africa. And so that's the topic under discussion. Michael, as always, it's really good to chat to you. Thank you for making some time.
Great to be with you, Mark. Always a pleasure.
Well, as I said, I'd love to start off just by talking in the broadest possible sweep. But what is the freedom of religion?
Well, freedom of religion is one of the most, I would say, foundational rights in any democracy. I think people don't understand or maybe realize exactly how costly it was to win this right. This right really came about after literally several centuries of bloody warfare, particularly in the European context, where there was effectively wars of religion, where you had the Reformation and the Protestant faith contesting with the Catholic faith, and of course, different political entities picked sides. And it was literally a bloodbath. In some of the bloodiest wars of all human history were fought over faith. And eventually it came to the place where there was just a general realization that, listen, we cannot have stable, democratic, or even effective societies if we don't grant some level of freedom of religion. And it was really, I think, concretized for the first time in 1948 in Section 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's a broad right. It's a basket of human rights, really. It's your freedom of conscience, thought, belief, opinion, faith, obviously, expression, association. It also, of course, is very foundational to parental rights, your rights to pass on your values and your views and your faith to your own children. So a very hard-won right, protected in the South African Constitution. It's worthwhile saying that, of course, this is not a right that is granted by the state. This is what some other constitutions, like the American ones, call an inalienable right. In other words, it's a God-given right. It's yours by virtue of the fact that you're a human being that has been given the freedom to choose by God Almighty himself. And therefore, it's a recognition of that right. And the state's role is to protect it and to uphold it and to support you in your exercise of it. Now, why I say that is because obviously one of the big challenges that we're seeing, and it's increasingly coming into the so-called Western world, where actually these rights were really foundational for many years, and that is to change and transform this right to religious freedom into basically a privilege, a license that is granted by the state. And instead of being a right, which it currently is and must be, that you can express in private and in public, you can live it out, you can pass it on, you can evangelize, you can proselytize, it becomes something that is more restricted to the private sphere, and it is granted under license by states. And if you obviously then go beyond the parameters of the license the state grants you, then it can be revoked. That isn't a right of religious freedom worth having, to be honest. And that's the big challenge that we face. And that's why we must fight very, very hard in South Africa to make sure that the state does not infringe on this right or erode it in any way, shape or form. That's what freedom of religion South Africa does. That's our daily bread and butter.
Michael, thank you so much for that overview. In South Africa, there have been a number of very high-profile cases involving churches, involving pastors. My understanding is the CRL Commission in South Africa, under the pretense to curb abuse and to promote accountability, is seeking the regulation of religion. I might be summarizing, I might be looking at another broad sweep, but that's my understanding. And my understanding is that they've recently released a white paper to that effect. Maybe you could begin just by explaining to us, what is a white paper? What's its purpose? How does it fit into this ongoing process?
Yeah, well, just to maybe backtrack one step. Of course, the CRL Rights Commission, I think many people will recall, in the 2016 to 19 period, they tried very hard to put forward and propose legislation to set up a kind of a peer review system where every religious practitioner would be vetted and approved or not, that you would have to belong to a so-called umbrella organization that would also be approved. And overarchingly, you'd have this peer review committee of Christians of your peer, obviously state appointed, state funded, and ultimately with the CRL as the final arbiter. And that's, of course, the institution of state. So basically, it was state regulation of religion top to bottom. And there were many days. There were 6 days in Parliament. A report was produced by the Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs Portfolio Committee, or known as we call it Parliament. And they did not accept the CRL's view that this peer review mechanism was the right solution. In fact, they said it was an infringement on religious freedom. They didn't adopt it. They said that the CRL actually was not the right entity to be involved in this way. It's certainly not in their statute and it's not in the Constitution. And unfortunately, lo and behold, the same chairperson of the CRL that was pushing this so hard during that previous period was reappointed in December last year. And immediately, and this year, she's been pushing very hard to effectively reintroduce the very same agenda that government or Parliament rejected. Now, what has happened is that they also appointed what's called a Section 22 committee. That's a committee that's appointed under the CRL Act. And they gave it a mandate basically to, for example, look at solutions to curb spiritual transgressions. What business has government got in spiritual transgressions, one might ask? But they also, their main mandate is to produce a legislative framework to introduce back again this peer review mechanism, which, as I say, Parliament's already rejected. So this committee leaked a white paper. A white paper is basically a official statement of government policy. It's normally prepared by government departments after public consultation, and it sets out sort of backgrounds, the objectives, the proposed frameworks, and it can be, and typically is, a major policy shift. Now, this particular document that was leaked from the committee is not that. So it doesn't have official status, but what it does is it shows, I think, very clearly the direction that this thing is going to be going. And so what it does, and amongst other things, is it outlines a comprehensive legislative framework of what the state would try to do when it comes to regulating and licensing and even disciplining faith communities. So it is very concerning.
I mean, it sounds troubling, Michael. You've already alluded to this inalienable right to religious freedom that we have by virtue of being human, by virtue of being created in God's image, recognized by the South African Constitution. How does this white paper interact with the Constitution of South Africa?
Well, it's completely at odds with the Constitution. You know, Section 15, as I say, guarantees everyone the right to freedom of religion, belief, thought, opinion, and that means the right to live out those beliefs freely, both as individuals and within communities. So when the state starts to decide what constitutes a legitimate belief or how it can be expressed, obviously it's then completely overstepped the mark. Now, the CRL and the committee have said publicly that they don't intend to do this. But of course, when you look at actually what is being proposed, it does the precise opposite.
Michael, flesh out a little bit for us. What's in this white paper? What exactly is so troubling? What ought to cause us concern?
Well, the first thing it does is it suggests establishing what it calls a peer review council, a religious peer review council. And that would be up to 80 members selected based on multi-faith, based on diversity. They need not necessarily even be people of faith. And they would have, as a council, pretty extensive powers that extends well beyond just simply sort of moral guidance or something like that. So, for example, one of the things that it proposes is that this committee can issue what it calls a restrictive activity notice. And what that will do is it will basically take away your license as a pastor, even as a church, even as an organization, and it will prevent you from operating, probably with some criminal sanctions to back it up, on the basis of an allegation. In other words, it doesn't have to be something that is proven that you've done that's illegal and unlawful. But effectively, it means that you can be shut down on suspicion alone. It also has a requirement potentially for what it calls mandatory training or supervision of ministers who it deems to have gone off the path, so to speak. And effectively, what that means is they will decide who is fit or not to serve in ministry. It even proposes being able to suspend marriage officers' licenses. And it also has as a sanction or as a redress, so to speak, the potential or the power to impose fines or to enforce what it calls approved spiritual practices as some form of penalty or restitution. Now, I mean, any one of those on their own would be concerning, but together it basically puts forward a proposition for regulation, a system where the state pretty much can control, suspend, or silence religious leaders or entire organizations. And of course, once that authority is taken by the state, then you no longer have any religious freedom worth the piece of paper it's written on. You literally have religion subject to government license, which can, of course, then be revoked by the state.
Now, Michael, as you're talking, I'm thinking of everything that you're saying, and I can think of bad examples from history where this kind of regulation of religion has worked, and it has always resulted in suffrage. It has always resulted in the oppression and persecution of the church. But in modern history, in modern times, are there examples of countries that are doing this presently?
Yes, look, I mean, there are obviously countries where your faith is pretty much restricted or even precluded. I mean, China would be an example. North Korea would be an example. But when we look at countries where there used to be a relative religious freedom, and there no longer is, Rwanda is an example which the CRL chair has said that she is also looking at as a kind of a model. So let's just have a look at what happens in Rwanda. Rwanda, by the way, is a fifth of the size of South Africa. It's 20% of South Africa's size of population. So any figure that I give you, you can times it by 4 or 5. So there, in order to be recognized as a religious leader, to be able to have a church, you have to have a degree, a 3-year degree in religious studies from an accredited institution, and the state then accredits it. So in other words, they tell you basically what you need to study to be orthodox enough for them to grant you your license. And you as a church must submit your internal bylaws, and you have to basically give your local authority outline every year of what work you're going to do in the community to support the community. And only when you're granted a collaboration letter are you allowed to proceed. You obviously have to disclose all your sources of financing and all your sources, all everything that you spend it on. And every year, as a church, you will pay 25,000 Rand for your license. Specifically, when it comes to what you can or cannot say, there is a total ban on political speech. So any form of, speaking truth to power, which is obviously a very critical component of religious freedom and the role of the church specifically, that is banned. And of course, any form of non-compliance means that you're immediately shut down. Now, to give you an example, since 2018, nearly 10,000 churches have been shut down in Rwanda, closed. So if you extrapolate that, if we have that system in South Africa, we're now in 2025, you could say that by 2030, maybe 40 to even 50,000 churches could have been shut down. So once you have basically opened this door, then the line between, what they self-regulation, that disappears. It's no longer self-regulation. It is state regulation, state control through and through. And of course, our South Africa's constitution specifically is designed to prevent exactly this kind of intrusion. And our own history of political control over belief or conscience was the reason why that was put in. Why are we going back there? That's a very big question.
Michael, playing devil's advocate for just a moment, we have seen high-profile cases of churches and pastors involved in all manner of shenanigans, some really decrepit stuff in South Africa. It's not like I'm thinking north of our borders. I'm talking inside of our borders. Is not a form of regulation required, or is there a viable alternative? Does FOISA have something that they can put on the table which makes sense and is implementable?
I think the first thing to say is that, of course, there is a very broad basket of regulations within which the church or any religious organization operates. If you're an NGO or an NPO or a charity or what have you, then there are certain things very much that are mandated that you must do, for example. Obviously, if you have an employee, you must register them. If you're a church, you have bylaws that you must abide by. You will obviously be bound by contractual law and all sorts of other regulations, noise regulations, and so on. But specifically, when we're looking at abuses, then we looked at every single example that the CRL put forward in their previous paper, where they were identifying, and you might remember the snake eaters and the petrol drinkers and the grass eaters and the prophet of doom. And that obviously is reprehensible behavior. But it's important to note that every single one of those instances, and in fact, I've never come across one instance that is not covered by our extensive civil and criminal law. And the issue there, of course, is if you have the laws, then what the state must do, because this is the state's job, is it must apply them, it must enforce them. And of course, if it doesn't enforce existing laws effectively and efficiently, then there is a problem. But that isn't a problem that's going to be solved by passing more legislation, because, of course, what happens is you have to enforce that too. So if they're not enforcing the law that exists effectively, why do they think that an additional layer of legislation is going to somehow magically solve the problem? Of course, it won't. But I think it's worthwhile pointing out that, of course, when laws are effectively applied and enforced, they work and they solve the problem. And by the way, you cannot say that, God told me to commit a crime. So the prophet of doom, remember him? He sprayed the insecticide in congregants' faces. And he claimed that God told him that it was going to heal them. Well, sorry, mate. He was charged with 5 counts of assault. He was found guilty. He was sentenced to a suspended jail sentence and a pretty hefty fine. And that is evidence that when the law is applied effectively, it works, it solves the problem. We had another very unfortunate case, which many people may remember, the Timothy Omatosa case. Again, no shortage of laws here. He was charged on 32 counts, sex trafficking, racketeering, money laundering, all sorts of things. But unfortunately, in that case, the National Prosecuting Authority made such a botched job of the prosecution that the judge had no option but to acquit. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't enough laws. What it means is that it wasn't effectively enforced. And I think I should say, on the good side, there was a case recently in Bloemfontein where a so-called pastor, quote unquote, who had raped 3 women was sentenced to 50 years in jail. So we've got the sanctions, we've got the penalties. And one of the things that we are saying is, of course, as a solution, so to speak, is where abuses occur, enforce the law. And I think also for pastors, I think it's, and you're in the communities, you're at the coalface, you know what's going on in your community. And if it's somebody who's just preaching very suspect doctrine, maybe go and confront him. If he's committing a crime, contact the police. We need to, I think, be watchmen in that sense. That is not being a sneak or a stooge or anything like that. It's just simply being a law-abiding citizen.
Michael, why should people care about this? People watch this podcast, they see this message, they hear what you have to say. But when it comes down to it, why should people care?
Well, look, this right to religious freedom is not just for people of faith. It is literally a cornerstone of every other democratic freedom. And if the state can control what you believe or say about faith, then ultimately, potentially, it can control what you believe or say about anything. So it's a democratic issue. And of course, what we want to do is to say this is the defining moment in our democracy. Don't just think of it as, let's just maybe the religious community had it coming to them. No, not at all. We all live under the rule of law, and we all must be law-abiding. But as soon as you start to let the state encroach and to start to regulate and decide what is or is not acceptable in terms of what you believe, then you're on a very slippery slope, or even how you express that belief. So that is really the crux and the core of the matter.
Michael, I would like to take an opportunity to point anyone who's watched this far to where they can find out more information about freedom of religion. They can go to your website. It's www.4sa.co.za. 4sa.org.za. It's 4sa.org.za. They can also find you on socials. You guys put stuff out on YouTube and you put stuff out on Facebook. And people can be informed. You guys blog, you guys put out information. And when the time is right, you also call people to action and make petitions and other mechanisms available to people so that you know how to put your hand up at the right time in terms of this ongoing discussion. Michael, thank you so much for making time to chat to us. We really do appreciate it and appreciate the work that you do. And I do trust that even as you go about speaking truth to power, that within the corridors of the South African government, people take heed and listen, because I am sure that a country which at least professes to be largely Christian, and that's without even counting together other religious groups, the reality is we do not want the state to regulate us. That's the bottom line. And so I hope that you are heard as you speak truth to power.
No, absolutely. And in fact, this is a battle that we cannot afford to lose, and we're going to fight it every which way we can. The good news is that there are moves afoot. There are engagements with government at the highest levels. And there are also two lawsuits, two pieces of litigation have been filed against the CRL and against this commission and this committee, and also the CRL chair herself. So this is going to be a very hard fought battle, and we're going to win it one way or another. And I think at the end of the day, it's interesting. I was at a conference yesterday and the chief rabbi was speaking, Rabbi Goldstein, and he said that if this law is passed, they would just simply refuse to comply with it. And that is a very serious, I think, note. If that's what faith communities are considering in response to this, then I'm not sure that this is a hill that government wants to die on, certainly because the elections are coming up next year. And I think any political party that's pushing this forward is going to find that it may well be reflected at the ballot box.
Thanks, Michael. And speak to you again soon.